Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where we expose the most sinister tales concealed in the obscurity. This evening, our journey takes us to the sun-baked landscape of Nevada in 1867, a time when the territory harbored mysteries untouched by civilization, and the ground hid horrors beyond mortal imagination. Standing alone at the fringe of the Humboldt Desert stood the Corpsewood homestead, a stark wooden construction that appeared to emerge from the barren terrain like a monument to solitude. The relentless wind sweeping across the alkali flats caused the weathered boards to moan, carrying fragrances of sage intermixed with something else, a cloying, decaying sweetness suspended in the atmosphere like an oath of decomposition. The closest neighbor resided 12 miles eastward, while the modest mining settlement of Elko required a complete day's travel northward, rendering the Corpsewood family as detached from community as the deceased are from the breathing. The household head, Silas Corpsewood, had arrived 3 years previously accompanied by his wife Evangeline, presenting themselves as cattle farmers pursuing a fresh start following the war. They acquired 80 acres of land that nobody else desired, where the earth proved too impoverished for cultivation and too meager for livestock grazing. Yet curiously, the household seemed to prosper where nothing else would flourish. Most strange was how the Corpsewood family appeared to multiply without reason. They had arrived with 2 offspring, a 7-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl, pallid, quiet beings with vacant stares. By 1867, travelers passing through reported observing at minimum 6 children of different ages laboring on the property, attending to peculiar patches of turned earth scattered across the land like recent burials. The youngsters moved with unnatural coordination, their appendages occasionally seeming strangely dimensioned, as if pieced together rather than developed naturally. They never attended educational institutions, never engaged in recreation, never wept. When questioned regarding his increasing household, Silas would grin, his teeth yellow against his weathered complexion, and clarify, "The Creator supplies for those who understand how to gather his abundance." Following the unseasonable precipitation of February 1867, Harold Burnett, while transporting goods from Elko, observed something that haunted him until his final breath. As his wagon neared the Corpsewood property, he witnessed Evangeline and the offspring assembled around a recently excavated pit. The soil appeared dark and saturated, and Evangeline reached downward into the cavity, retrieving what seemed to be a small, pale extremity, no longer than a lower arm, that quivered in her hold. The youngsters encircled her, extending their hands as if anticipating a blessing. Evangeline pressed the squirming appendage into the soil of a prepared wooden container and partially covered it with rich dark earth that appeared inconsistent with the dusty Nevada landscape. She murmured words that Burnett couldn't distinguish, and the youngsters responded collectively with voices that sounded like numerous and none simultaneously. When Silas emerged from the dwelling and noticed Burnett's approaching wagon, he rapidly ushered his household inside, clutching the wooden container to Evangeline's chest like an infant. By the time Burnett arrived at the residence, the family greeted him with unsettling normalcy, though he couldn't avoid noticing fresh soil beneath their fingernails and embedded in the creases of their palms. The subsequent week, a new child appeared at the Corpsewood homestead, a small girl with mismatched eyes and fingers that seemed excessively numerous on her right hand. Whispers from Elko traveled more swiftly than the supply wagons that reluctantly made their way to the Corpsewood property. Harold Burnett, his hands trembling around a tin cup of rye whiskey at the Rusty Nail Saloon, described what he had witnessed only after the liquid courage had loosened his speech. The assembled miners and cattle workers exchanged glances reflecting both doubt and discomfort, their weathered faces lit by oil lamps that cast elongated shadows across the rough-hewn walls. "Children don't develop like that," muttered Jeremiah Walsh, a silver prospector whose deeply lined countenance bore the marks of 2 decades spent hunting fortune in the Nevada mountains. "Not natural children, leastwise." The Corpsewood mystery deepened when Dr. Thomas Abernathy, returning from treating a fractured leg at a ranch beyond the Corpsewood land, reported glimpsing Silas excavating in the difficult earth by moonlight. The argent illumination had exposed what appeared to be a collection of small wooden containers arranged with the precision of coffins awaiting burial. He was speaking to them, Abernathy confided to Sheriff Mills the following day. Whispering into those boxes like a man might whisper to his lover. The physician's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his pipe, the gesture revealing his unease more than his measured words. "And Sheriff, I swear upon my medical credentials that I heard something answering from within." The spring of 1867 brought unusual fertility to the desert surrounding the Corpsewood homestead. Travelers on the dusty road reported observing patches of luxuriant vegetation encircling the property like a verdant moat, the plants unnaturally vibrant against the dun-colored landscape. Most disturbing were the peculiar blossoms that emerged, flesh-colored growths with what appeared to be minute fingers unfurling from bulbous centers, reaching skyward as if grasping for salvation. Evangeline Corpsewood was spotted at the general store in Elko only twice that spring, purchasing quantities of salt, sulfur, and coal ash that puzzled the shopkeeper. Her own hands had grown pale and translucent, the blue veins beneath her skin prominent as rivers on a map. She moved with a strange halting gait, as though uncertain of how her limbs should function in concert. "She ain't right," Clara Wilson, the shopkeeper's wife, declared after Evangeline's second visit. "Them eyes don't blink enough," and her voice sounds like more than one person trying to speak at once. Most disturbing was the incident in early May when a band of Shoshone passing near the Corpsewood land fled in terror, abandoning their planned route to water. Their chief, upon reaching Elko, would say only that the earth around the wooden house gave birth to abominations and that the family was planting pieces to grow the whole. The translator struggled with the chief's words, claiming the Shoshone language held specific terms for unnatural creation that had no English equivalent. By midsummer, the Corpsewood children numbered 8, though no pregnancy had ever been observed. The newest additions moved with jerky precision, their skin bearing a patchwork quality in certain lights as if assembled from different sources. Their eyes reflected no childish wonder, only a hunger that seemed ancient and patient. Sheriff James Mills found himself at a crossroads of duty and dread as July's unforgiving heat settled over Nevada territory. A man of 45 years with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that had witnessed the darkest chapters of the war, Mills had always prided himself on rational thinking. Yet the mounting reports about the Corpsewood family left him disturbed in ways that no gunfight or border dispute ever had. "Nonsense and superstition," he muttered to himself as he saddled his chestnut mare. But the steady hand that had drawn iron against cattle rustlers and claim jumpers now trembled slightly as he prepared for the ride to the homestead. The journey across the alkali flats was silent, save for the rhythmic crunch of hooves on parched earth. As Mills approached the property, he noticed how the quality of light seemed to change, a sickly yellow cast that made his mare snort and toss her head in protest. The vegetation around the homestead appeared wrong somehow, too lush, too vibrant, with an oily sheen that caught the sunlight like wet flesh. "Mr. Corpsewood," Mills called out, his voice sounding thin and ineffectual in the strange stillness. Silas emerged from the barn, a tall figure silhouetted against the weathered wood. His movements were fluid, yet somehow disconcerting, as if his joints operated on different principles than those of ordinary men. He approached with a smile that never reached his eyes, flat obsidian discs that reflected nothing. "Sheriff Mills, what an unexpected pleasure," Silas said, his articulation precise, but with an underlying cadence that suggested multiple tongues working in imperfect harmony. "Have you come to inquire about our prosperity in this unforgiving land?" "Received some disturbing reports, Mr. Corpsewood," Mills replied, fighting the urge to retreat. "Neighbors concerned about unusual activities. Talk of children appearing without explanation." Silas's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too uniform. "Surely you understand the blessing of family, Sheriff. Each child a miracle of creation." His hands, impossibly smooth and unmarred by the labors of frontier life, gestured toward the house. "Would you care to meet them? To see how they flourish under our care?" Before Mills could respond, the door to the homestead creaked open. Evangeline stood framed in the doorway, her once beautiful features now stretched across her face like ill-fitting clothing. Behind her, the children emerged in perfect unison, each step synchronized as they arranged themselves in a semicircle. "My God," Mills whispered, unable to mask his horror. The children, if they could be called such, bore subtle yet undeniable abnormalities. A boy of apparent 9 years possessed fingers of different lengths, the knuckles misaligned. Beside him stood twin girls with identical features, save for a seam-like line that ran down the center of each face, as if they had been split and reassembled. Another child, sexless and pale, observed Mills with eyes set too far apart and a face that seemed composed of disparate pieces. "They are perfect, aren't they?" Evangeline's voice resonated with unnatural harmonics. "Each one cultivated with such care, such precision." Mills's hand instinctively moved toward his holster as Silas stepped closer, leaning in with conspiratorial intimacy. "We have perfected what others merely attempt, Sheriff," he whispered, his breath carrying the scent of turned soil and copper. "The art of creation without the limitations of natural birth. Would you like to see our nursery? The garden where the next generation takes root." Sheriff Mills fought against every instinct that commanded him to flee as Silas led him toward the rear of the property where the nursery awaited. The earth beneath his boots felt unnaturally soft, yielding like flesh rather than soil, and with each step a faint squelching sound emerged, as if the ground itself were saturated with fluids that had no business in desert terrain. Behind the main house stood a series of long, narrow beds enclosed by wooden frames, not unlike garden plots, but there was nothing vegetable about what grew there. Each bed contained dark, moist earth riddled with pale protrusions that Mills initially mistook for oddly shaped mushrooms. Upon closer examination, his gorge rose violently into his throat. Fingers, dozens of them, emerging from the soil like grotesque sprouts, wriggling with deliberate motion. Some were tiny like those of infants. Others were larger, their nails fully formed and caked with the very earth from which they grew. In one plot, a partially formed face pressed upward through the loam, its single visible eye blinking languidly, its quarter-formed mouth working silently as if practicing how to speak. The secret, Silas explained with the proud tone of a master gardener, is in the preparation of the soil. Certain minerals, certain fluids, certain incantations drawn from texts most men have never laid eyes upon. He knelt beside one bed and tenderly caressed an emerging ear, perfectly shaped but growing in isolation, its pinkish whorls twitching at his touch. We discovered the method quite by accident when our firstborn died on the journey west. Evangeline approached, carrying a copper watering can that emitted a coppery metallic scent. We couldn't bear to part with little Thomas, she said, her voice layering upon itself in discordant harmonics. So we buried his limbs separately with the proper amendments and found that each piece would grow anew. But the new growths were imperfect, incomplete, until we discovered how to graft. Silas continued, gesturing toward a workbench where glass jars contained floating specimens, fingers, toes, what appeared to be a partial tongue preserved in cloudy liquid. Surgical tools crusted with dark residue lay in precise formation beside leather straps and crude metal frames resembling miniature stretching racks. Mills watched in mute horror as one of the older children approached with a small spade and began to carefully excavate around a fully formed hand that protruded from the soil. The hand convulsed as it was freed, fingers splaying wide before curling inward. The child placed the disembodied appendage in a wooden box filled with damp moss and carried it reverently toward the barn. Once harvested, they must be joined while still vital, Evangeline explained, pouring the contents of her watering can over a plot where what seemed to be the crown of a small head was emerging, wisps of dark hair already sprouting from the scalp. The suturing must be precise. The bonding agents applied liberally. Silas placed a hand on Mills's shoulder, his grip unnaturally strong, his fingers pressing into precise points that sent waves of paralytic weakness through the sheriff's body. "We've been experimenting with adult specimens as well," he confided, his mouth too close to Mills's ear, "but we've lacked a complete subject to work with. Your arrival is most providential." In that moment, Sheriff Mills understood with perfect clarity that he was never meant to return to Elko, that his flesh was destined for the rich, dark beds behind the Corpsewood home, and that pieces of him would rise again, transformed by the family's ungodly husbandry, into something neither living nor dead, but horrifically between. With trembling hands that betrayed his terror, Sheriff Mills reached for his revolver, but found his limbs sluggish, responding as if through deep water. The children had surrounded him in a perfect circle, their mismatched eyes tracking his every desperate movement. The nearest child, a girl whose left arm hung several inches longer than her right, smiled with teeth arranged in concentric circles rather than orderly rows. "The body resists," Silas observed clinically. "They always do, though the mind understands the honor we bestow." Mills stumbled backward, his boot catching on something partially buried. Looking down, he saw a human jawbone, weathered but recognizable, with several teeth still clinging to their sockets. Beyond it, the earth was disturbed in dozens of small, regular plots marked with crude wooden crosses. Not graves, he realized with mounting horror, but nursery markers. "You'll be joining our family, Sheriff," Evangeline crooned, approaching with a rusted surgical saw. "Parts of you, anyway. The rest will nourish the next generation." With desperate strength born of terror, Mills broke free of Silas's grip and staggered toward his horse. The mare, sensing the abomination of this place, reared in panic as he approached. He managed to grasp the saddle horn and pull himself up, spurring the animal into a frantic gallop away from the Corpsewood property, the family's harmonized laughter chasing him across the alkali flats. 2 days later, Mills returned with 7 armed men from Elko, only to find the homestead abandoned, the house standing empty like a hollowed skull. The nursery beds had been hastily covered with soil, though one small hand still protruded from the earth, its fingers curled as if beckoning them closer. In the root cellar, accessible through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, they discovered a leather-bound journal meticulously documenting the Corpsewood experiments. The following excerpt was later transcribed into official territorial records before the book was burned by order of the county judge. April 17, 1867. The grafting between subjects C and F proved most successful. The fusion of disparate tissues achieved through application of the solution, 3 parts quicksilver, 1 part dissolved bone, 7 drops of the maternal essence, created a bond indistinguishable from natural growth. The new entity displays remarkable durability and improved cognitive function over previous specimens. Most encouragingly, it bears no memory of its component origins, believing itself whole and original. May 23, 1867. Specimen H failed catastrophically. The rejection occurred at the joining of the throat and chest cavity, the flesh blackening and liquefying within hours. We have preserved the head, which continues to show signs of awareness despite separation. It will serve as valuable study material. June 11, 1867. A breakthrough. The inclusion of spinal fluid from the original matrix subject allows for complete neural integration between harvested components. Subject J now functions with perfect coordination and has begun to speak. When asked its name, it responded with 3 different voices simultaneously. Beautiful. The Corpsewood family was never found, though in the autumn of 1867, a mining settlement near the California border reported a strange family passing through, a tall man and his sickly wife, accompanied by nearly a dozen silent children who all moved with the same peculiar gait. 3 months later, that settlement was found abandoned, the buildings intact, but empty of all inhabitants. In the surrounding soil, investigators discovered dozens of freshly turned patches of earth, each approximately the size of a single human limb. The territorial investigation into the Corpsewood family faded into obscurity as the harsh winter of 1867 descended upon Nevada. Snow blanketed the abandoned homestead, mercifully concealing the grotesque garden beds beneath a pristine shroud of white. Yet beneath that frozen crust, something continued to stir, microscopic movements detectable only by the most sensitive instruments of modern science, had such devices existed in that primitive era. When spring thaw arrived, Augustus Prendergast, a botanical researcher from San Francisco with an interest in desert flora, purchased the property at a fraction of its already modest value. The locals watched with a mixture of pity and dread as the academician arrived with his collection of scientific instruments, unaware of the land's grim history. The county clerk, overcome with ethical qualms, had misfiled the official records of Sheriff Mills's discovery, consigning the horror to memory rather than documentation. Prendergast's letters to his colleagues at Berkeley reveal the gradual unraveling of a scientific mind confronted with the incomprehensible. His initial correspondence detailed the unusual fertility of certain soil patches on the property, describing an inexplicable organic content that defied conventional analysis. "The earth itself possesses qualities I have never encountered," he wrote in late April. When held to the ear, certain samples emit sounds reminiscent of distant whispering. Most curious is how specimens stored in sealed glass containers appear to shift position overnight, though I attribute this to settling caused by temperature fluctuations. By June, his scientific detachment had eroded into something approaching religious fervor. His penmanship, once meticulous, became increasingly erratic, the words flowing across the page in undulating patterns suggestive of a hand guided by more than mere conscious intent. "I have witnessed the birth of a new biological paradigm," one fragment reads, the edges of the paper stained with a substance later determined to be a mixture of soil and human blood. "The division between plant and animal, between living and deceased tissue, is not fixed as we have believed, but permeable." What the Corpsewood family began was not abomination, but evolution, the next magnificent step in creation's journey. His final documented communication, discovered tucked inside a hollow fence post by the property's next owner some 30 years later, contained no words, merely a detailed anatomical drawing of a human arm with annotations indicating optimal incision points for dismemberment. The paper itself had taken root, fine tendrils of vegetable matter growing from its edges, still alive despite 3 decades of darkness. Most disturbing was the discovery made in 1903 when a flash flood cut a deep ravine through the eastern edge of the former Corpsewood property. Exposed in the striated layers of soil was an intricate network of pale root-like structures extending for hundreds of yards in all directions. Upon closer examination, the county coroner confirmed what local witnesses had already recognized with instinctive horror: these were not roots at all, but human nervous tissue, preserved and somehow still intact, branching through the earth like an obscene parody of a botanical system. To this day, nothing will grow on that plot of Nevada desert except for a peculiar strain of sage that blooms only at night, its flowers shaped remarkably like tiny, perfect human ears, turned upward as if listening for instructions from below. The archives of the Nevada Historical Society contain a curious footnote to the Corpsewood saga that few researchers have examined. In the summer of 1868, nearly a year after the family's disappearance, a Paiute medicine man named Wovoka, who would later gain prominence as the prophet of the ghost dance movement, led a ritual cleansing of the abandoned property at the request of tribal elders who claimed the land whispered with hungry voices. According to the journal of Reverend Thomas Holloway, who observed the ceremony with anthropological interest, Wovoka and 7 tribal members encircled the property with a barrier of crushed turquoise and powdered sage before setting fire to the remaining structures. As the flames consumed the weathered timber, Holloway recorded that a most disturbing ululation emerged from the earth itself, not as smoke rises, but as if the ground beneath gave voice to agony. Most revealing is an account preserved in the personal papers of Jeremiah Walsh, the silver prospector who had once dismissed the Corpsewood rumors at the Rusty Nail Saloon. Having fallen on hard times, Walsh attempted to salvage building materials from the property's burned remains in early 1869. His diary, penned in a shaky hand that deteriorates throughout the narrative, describes his discovery. Beneath the charred floorboards, unearthed today, a chamber hewn from the very bedrock, no larger than a water closet, yet containing implements that challenged sanity's grasp. A copper vat, green with corrosion, save where dark fluids had preserved the metal. Beside it, a collection of glass vessels marked with symbols reminiscent of alchemical notation, yet perverted in form. Most disturbing was the leather-bound volume hidden within the stonework, its cover fashioned from material I dare not identify, though it possesses the texture and pliability of human dermis. The text within, written in no language known to me, contains illustrations of such depraved character that I have contemplated my own eye's extraction as preferable to remembering what I have seen. Diagrams of human forms spliced and reassembled like garments stitched by a lunatic tailor. Formulas denoting combinations of substances, some familiar as mercury and sulfur, others described only by symbols resembling astronomical notations for celestial bodies unknown to modern science. One page contained pressed specimens, thin slices of matter preserved between waxed papers. They resembled nothing so much as cross-sections of tissue that appeared simultaneously plant-like and distressingly animal in character, with structures akin to both vascular systems and root networks intertwined. Walsh's diary ends abruptly 3 days later with an entry consisting of a single sentence: "They grow beneath the soil even now, awaiting collection." His body was discovered 2 weeks afterward by cattle drovers, seated peacefully against a juniper tree 5 miles from the Corpsewood property. The medical examiner noted that Walsh's hands had been surgically removed with remarkable precision, the wounds cauterized to prevent blood loss. More disturbing was the autopsy finding that his vocal cords had been excised and replaced with what appeared to be tendrils of an unidentifiable organic substance that extended into his lungs and esophagus. The following spring, an unusually fertile patch of desert appeared precisely where Walsh had been found, bearing a previously undocumented species of succulent with finger-like protrusions that curled when touched, as if making a beckoning gesture to all who passed. The Corpsewood legacy manifested beyond the confines of their abandoned property, seeping outward like a stain through the fabric of the Nevada territory. In the autumn of 1872, a peculiar medical phenomenon began appearing in settlements within a 100-mile radius of the former homestead. Physicians documented cases of spontaneous bifurcation, patients developing secondary vestigial digits alongside existing fingers and toes. More alarming were instances of children born with unusual dermal patterns resembling suture lines across otherwise unmarked skin. Dr. Elijah Montgomery of Virginia City maintained detailed records of these anomalies, noting with scientific precision how these marks often appeared along the same anatomical planes that a surgeon might select for limb removal. Most disturbing was his observation that these lines would occasionally pulse with a rhythm independent of the patient's heartbeat, as if responding to some external cadence imperceptible to human senses. The territory itself seems infected, Montgomery wrote in his private correspondence to a colleague at Johns Hopkins. The soil here yields crops with subtle deformities, carrots emerging from the ground already joined like clasped fingers, potatoes developing protrusions reminiscent of facial features. I have begun to question whether the very molecular structure of this region has been fundamentally altered by forces beyond our current scientific understanding. The water table beneath the former Corpsewood land developed peculiar properties that defied chemical analysis. Wells drilled within 5 miles of the property produced water with an unusually high mineral content that, while not immediately harmful when consumed, caused livestock to develop aberrant behavioral patterns. Cattle would arrange themselves in precise geometric formations at dusk, standing motionless until dawn. Chickens laid eggs with translucent shells through which observers could witness embryonic development occurring at thrice the natural rate. In the territorial archives, preserved among documents deemed too unsettling for public access, lies testimony from Martha Holloway, midwife to 3 generations of Nevada families. Her affidavit, sealed by judicial order until 1950, describes delivering infants in the region whose umbilical cords possessed unnatural branching structures, as if attempting to form secondary connections to the maternal host. Most remarkable was her account of twins born to the Henderson family in 1874, whose bodily connection transcended normal understanding. Though separated at birth and possessed of distinct anatomical structures, the infants displayed simultaneous movement even when placed in different rooms. When one was subjected to stimulus, a pinprick or cold cloth, both reacted in perfect synchronicity. Most disquieting was their vocalization, never crying individually, but producing sounds in harmonic consonants that suggested a single consciousness operating through dual forms. The territorial governor, upon receiving reports compiled by the newly established Bureau of Anomalous Phenomena, authorized a confidential expedition to locate the missing Corpsewood family. The 5-man contingent departed from Carson City in January 1875, equipped with specialized equipment designed to detect chemical anomalies in soil and water. None returned. Their last documented position placed them near a nameless arroyo 50 miles southeast of the original homestead, precisely where a small farming community would emerge 2 decades later, populated entirely by families with no verifiable history prior to their arrival, and whose children all shared the same peculiar gait described by Sheriff Mills years before. The Corpsewood affair faded into whispers as the century waned, becoming little more than a cautionary tale exchanged by drunken prospectors or nervous settlers huddled around fires on winter nights. Yet its tendrils reached forward through time, manifesting in subtle corruptions that only the most discerning observers would connect to those horrors of 1867. Among the private collections of the Carson City Museum of Natural History lies a curious document donated anonymously in 1912, a leather-bound ledger containing pressed botanical specimens collected by an unnamed botanist traversing Nevada in 1888. Most entries follow scientific convention with Latin nomenclature and detailed observations. However, the final third of the volume documents what the collector termed spontaneous anthropomorphic vegetation, plants exhibiting characteristics inconsistent with known biological taxonomy. The most disturbing specimen, labeled simply as Homo florus, consists of a pressed flower reminiscent of a desert lily yet possessing structures unmistakably similar to miniature human vertebrae forming its stem. The petals, arranged in concentric whorls, bear microscopic patterns identical to human fingerprints. The accompanying notes state, specimen found growing exclusively in circular formation approximately 12 feet in diameter. Local rancher reports discovering similar growth annually since 1869, always in same location, despite attempts to burn, salt, or otherwise sterilize the soil. In 1893, the newly established University of Nevada commissioned a geological survey that included soil samples from every county. The samples taken within 30 miles of the former Corpsewood property contained anomalous organic compounds that defied categorization, neither fully plant nor animal in nature. Under microscopic examination, these compounds exhibited behavior described by researcher Dr. Emanuel Whitcraft as purposeful reorganization, the molecular structures actively rearranging themselves when exposed to electrical stimulation or human blood serum. Whitcraft's subsequent disappearance coincided with a curious phenomenon reported by railroad workers constructing a line through the territory, the overnight emergence of small hand-shaped cacti with articulated fingers that seemed to gradually change position throughout the day, as if reaching toward passing trains. Perhaps most telling was the census anomaly of 1900, when government officials documented an unusual demographic pattern centered around Elko County. Within a 50-mile radius, family structures defied statistical norms, households reporting children of varying ages with no corresponding birth records, all bearing subtle physical similarities despite no apparent blood relation. More disturbing were the medical examiner's reports from the same region, noting an unusual prevalence of post-mortem anomalies, bodies exhibiting surgical precision in their decomposition, with certain tissues remaining inexplicably preserved while others deteriorated at accelerated rates. Professor Helena Montgomery of Stanford University, investigating folklore of the American West in 1915, recorded an oral tradition among certain isolated Nevada communities describing renewal families who could birth children from the blessed earth. These communities practiced unusual agricultural rituals, burying personal items, locks of hair, nail clippings, occasionally extracted teeth in specific patterns throughout their fields, believing this would ensure fertile crops and healthy livestock. The practice, Montgomery noted with academic detachment, bore striking similarities to the grafting techniques documented in the partially recovered Corpsewood journals, suggesting their methodologies had not disappeared, but rather had been abstracted into cultural practices that persisted long after the originators had vanished from historical record. In the archives of the Nevada State University, preserved within a lead-lined box accessible only with special permission, lies a collection of glass photographic plates dating to 1922. These images, captured by anthropologist Dr. Harriet Caldwell during her extensive documentation of Western burial practices, contain the only known visual evidence of the Corpsewood legacy's continuation into the 20th century. The most revealing plate, labeled simply Subject Family X, Elko County, shows 7 individuals arranged in formal portrait fashion outside a modest clapboard house. Their faces are deliberately blurred, not by damage to the plate, as Caldwell's meticulous notes explain, but by her own hand, an unprecedented action from a scientist renowned for her documentary precision. Ethical considerations compel me to obscure certain physiological characteristics, she wrote in her accompanying field journal. The familial resemblances observed in subjects A through G represent biological impossibilities that would invite unwanted scrutiny upon this isolated community. The dermatological anomalies, particularly the distinct seam-like patterns visible at major articulation points, suggest surgical or other artificial intervention inconsistent with natural human development. Most disturbing is her clinical observation that all subjects exhibited synchronized involuntary movements, including respiration and blinking, despite claiming no blood relation between certain members. Upon physical examination limited to extremities, I discovered identical fingerprint patterns on specific digits of different individuals, a genetic impossibility suggesting either fabrication of epidermal features or tissue transference through means unknown to medical science. The Nevada State Agricultural Commission's confidential reports from 1927 document an inexplicable pattern of soil enrichment in previously barren areas surrounding the original Corpsewood property. Analysis revealed organic compounds containing human genetic material interwoven with previously unclassified fungal structures capable of preserving and apparently transmitting biological information across plant-based networks. Dr. Edward Blackwell, a soil microbiologist with the Commission, wrote in his suppressed findings, the mycelial networks extend through approximately 200 square miles of terrain, connecting seemingly disparate biological communities through filaments that bear disturbing resemblance to human nervous tissue. Most alarming is the network's apparent response to electrical stimulation, whereby disturbance at one location produces measurable activity at distances exceeding 70 miles, suggesting a territory-wide communicative organism of unprecedented complexity. In 1931, during construction of the Hoover Dam, workers excavating the Nevada side uncovered a sealed ceramic vessel containing preserved biological specimens. Before federal authorities confiscated the container, several engineers reported seeing what appeared to be infant-sized limbs with fully developed musculature, yet no signs of decomposition despite their apparent age. Carbon dating later performed in secrecy estimated the specimen's age at approximately 64 years, dating precisely to 1867. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery in 1942 when military exercises in the Nevada desert uncovered a network of narrow tunnels beneath the alkali flats. The tunnels, roughly the diameter of a human crawl space, contained niches carved at regular intervals, each holding small wooden boxes identical to those described in Sheriff Mills's original report. Inside each box, rich dark soil surrounded fragments of preserved human tissue, each fragment sprouting fine white tendrils that extended through microscopic holes in the boxes and connected to neighboring chambers in an intricate pulsating web. The passage of time could not fully erode the Corpsewood influence, even as the frontier gave way to modernity. During the atomic testing era of the 1950s, government scientists monitoring radiation patterns in the Nevada desert noted anomalous readings centered around the former Corpsewood property. Monitoring stations detected organic material in soil samples that appeared to absorb and redistribute radioactive particles in patterns suggesting deliberate organization rather than random dispersal. Dr. Eleanor Winters, a biophysicist assigned to the Classified Biological Response Initiative, documented these findings in a confidential memorandum that remained sealed until 1987. The irradiated samples demonstrate unprecedented adaptive capacity under conditions that would render conventional organic matter inert. These specimens exhibit accelerated mutation along seemingly predetermined pathways. Most disturbing is their response to proximity with uncontaminated biological material. The radioactive samples appear to reach toward living tissue, extending microscopic filaments reminiscent of both fungal hyphae and human capillaries. Her laboratory journal, discovered among her personal effects after her suicide in 1957, contains more troubling observations. The final entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described dreams in which she was visited by children with too many joints who showed her the proper method of division. Her colleagues reported finding her laboratory meticulous as always, save for a single petri dish containing what appeared to be a severed human fingertip that, according to spectrographic analysis, contained genetic material matching Dr. Winters's own DNA profile, despite her body being discovered intact. The most compelling evidence linking the Corpsewood legacy to contemporary events emerged during the extensive groundwater studies conducted in 1976. Environmental scientists mapping aquifer patterns beneath central Nevada discovered what hydrologist Dr. Martin Shelby termed biological contamination of impossible antiquity. Water samples drawn from depths exceeding 300 feet contain suspended organic particulates that, when isolated, continue to demonstrate metabolic activity despite being separated from any known nutrient source. The microstructures appear to function as biological transmitters, Dr. Shelby wrote in his classified report to the Environmental Protection Agency. When placed in proximity to cellular material from different sources, plant, animal, human, the particulates facilitate spontaneous genetic exchange across kingdom boundaries, resulting in hybrid structures that should be biologically impossible. Most disturbing was his observation that consumption of contaminated water correlated with subtle physiological changes in local populations, slightly altered gait patterns, enhanced night vision, and most notably, unusually rapid healing of superficial wounds with distinctive scar patterns resembling deliberate sutures. The Watershed Protection Authority subsequently constructed containment barriers around key aquifers in 1978, publicly citing conventional pollution concerns. The true purpose, revealed in declassified documents, was to isolate what one senior official described as biological information transmission through groundwater systems that appeared to be programming rather than contaminating the cellular structures of organisms throughout the region. The confidential EPA designation for this phenomenon, Corpsewood Transmissive Syndrome, provides the only official acknowledgement that government agencies had connected modern anomalies to those terrible events of 1867, when a family on the edges of civilization discovered that human remains, properly prepared, could germinate like seeds, growing new flesh that retained memories embedded not in the mind, but in the very cells themselves. The silence surrounding the Corpsewood saga deepened as the decades passed. Yet occasionally, the earth itself would speak in whispers to those attuned to its darkest secrets. In 1984, a graduate student from UCLA's Department of Anthropological Studies stumbled upon the case while researching frontier burial practices. Miranda Chen's dissertation work led her to a remote corner of the Nevada desert where local conservationists had discovered unusual growth patterns in the vegetation, concentric circles of unnaturally vibrant plant life surrounding patches of earth where nothing would grow. The soil itself rejects certain intrusions, noted Dr. Chen in her field journal, the pages now preserved behind temperature-controlled glass at the Smithsonian's restricted archives. Indigenous flora arranges itself in patterns suggestive of deliberate cultivation rather than natural dispersion. Most remarkable is the evident communication between seemingly disconnected growth sites. When one area is disturbed, plants up to 15 miles distant display synchronized responses, their leaves turning to face the disturbance regardless of solar position. Her investigation led her to elderly residents whose grandparents had shared fragmented stories of the garden family, who could grow children from the blessed earth. These accounts, dismissed by most academics as frontier superstition, contained consistent elements that aligned with the fragmentary official records of the Corpsewood case. Most revealing was her interview with Elijah Running Deer, a Paiute elder whose grandfather had participated in Wovoka's purification ceremony at the Corpsewood property. The transcripts reveal a traditional knowledge that contextualizes the horror within indigenous understanding. My grandfather told me the white family had broken the boundary between worlds, Running Deer explained, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he spoke. There are places where the membrane between life and death grows thin. The ancient ones knew these places and avoided them. The Corpsewood people did not avoid. They pierced. They found where life and death meet and twisted what should not be twisted. Running Deer described tribal oral histories of those who grow wrong, beings that appeared human but moved with the rhythm of many becoming one. His people had maintained vigil over certain sites for generations, performing rituals to strengthen the boundaries between worlds at specific celestial alignments. In the spring of 1985, Dr. Chen's research took an ominous turn when she discovered a small isolated community in eastern Nevada whose founding coincided with the Corpsewood disappearance. The settlement, absent from official census records yet clearly established for generations, practiced unusual agricultural methods involving the burial of personal effects, and more disturbingly, what appeared to be human tissue samples incorporated into their planting rituals. Their children display remarkable physical similarities despite apparent genetic diversity, she noted in her final documented field report. All possess identical scars at major articulation points, wrists, elbows, knees, which residents attribute to growing pains, but which medical consultation suggests are consistent with surgical joining. Most disconcerting is their synchronized physical development. Adolescents of the same approximate age exhibit identical growth patterns down to simultaneous voice changes and dental eruption schedules. Dr. Chen's research ended abruptly when she disappeared during a solo expedition to catalog unusual botanical specimens surrounding the community. Her abandoned vehicle contained field notes describing a network of root-like structures beneath the topsoil that, when excavated, revealed tissue consistency and cellular structure more animal than plant, with nerve-like conductivity when stimulated. The final page of her journal contained a single observation written in uncharacteristically distorted handwriting: "They don't die here. They divide." The archives of the Nevada Historical Society yielded one final terrible revelation when, in 1989, a storage facility fire damaged numerous 19th-century documents. Among the water-stained papers rescued from the blaze was a previously uncatalogued journal belonging to Evangeline Corpsewood herself, its leather cover cracked and discolored with age, the binding sewn with what experts would later confirm were human tendon fibers. The text, written in a flowing script that occasionally splintered into multiple handwriting styles on the same page, revealed the true origins of their ungodly experiments. Evangeline's earliest entries, dated 1862, depicted a grieving mother whose 3 children had succumbed to scarlet fever in Pennsylvania. Her descent from conventional grief into obsession was documented in meticulous detail, her theological studies gradually giving way to ancient alchemical texts promising the restoration of life. "I have discovered that death is merely an incomplete understanding," she wrote in an entry from 1863. "The body is not a singular temple but a congregation of lesser churches, each capable of individual worship if properly consecrated." The texts speak of separation as the key. What dies whole may live again in parts, and what lives in parts may be assembled into glorious new configurations. Most disturbing were her detailed accounts of grave robberies conducted across 5 states as the family journeyed westward, collecting specimens from recently buried children whose tender tissues remained receptive to reanimation. The careful diagrams accompanying these notes illustrated how particular burial soils, combined with specific mineral compounds and ritual incantations, created what she termed germination matrices, capable of nurturing severed appendages into partial regeneration. "The fingers bloom first," she observed with clinical detachment. "Their delicate bones provide perfect scaffolding for the new growth. We have determined that moonlight harvested during the waning gibbous phase yields the most vigorous specimens, their movements more purposeful than those gathered under other celestial conditions." Her later entries revealed how the family's techniques evolved after discovering an ancient petroglyph site in eastern Nevada, where indigenous carvings depicted what Evangeline interpreted as the sacred dismemberment and holy reassembly of human forms. Beneath these carvings, they unearthed clay tablets inscribed with formulae that allowed them to progress from mere regeneration to complete fusion of disparate parts. The journal's final pages contained pressed specimens, paper-thin slices of tissue preserving the boundary lines where different human sources had been successfully joined. Evangeline's notations indicated triumph: "The children speak now with one voice through many mouths. They remember nothing of their component origins. They believe themselves whole and original, born of natural processes rather than sacred assembly." The curator who discovered this journal reported peculiar phenomena during its examination: a persistent sweet, earthy scent emanating from the pages, and small movements visible in his peripheral vision whenever the book was open under bright light. Most troubling was his observation that certain ink lines appeared to shift positions between viewings, the text subtly rearranging itself as if the very words were alive and seeking new configurations. Within a fortnight of the journal's discovery, the curator requested indefinite leave, citing insomnia and persistent dreams of children growing beneath the floorboards. He was later found in his garage, surrounded by dozens of small potted plants arranged in concentric circles, each containing a single buried finger, his own, methodically harvested from both hands, the wounds cauterized with surgical precision. The Corpsewood legacy persists into our present era, though few recognize the tendrils of influence still reaching through time from that Nevada homestead. In 2001, a geological survey team employing ground-penetrating radar to map aquifer systems beneath the Great Basin made a discovery that remains classified under national security protocols. Their equipment detected an anomalous network of tunnels approximately 15 feet below the surface, extending outward in a perfect radial pattern from what was once the Corpsewood property. Dr. Lenora Samuels, lead geophysicist on the project, described the structures in her confidential report as displaying architectural precision inconsistent with natural formation or conventional human engineering. Most disturbing was her observation that these passages exhibited evidence of expansion. Comparing initial scans with follow-up surveys 6 months later revealed unmistakable growth at a rate of approximately 3 inches per month in all directions. The material composition defies conventional analysis, Dr. Samuels noted. While primarily organic in nature, the cellular structure combines elements of human epithelial tissue with fungal characteristics and vascular systems more commonly associated with higher-order plants. Most concerning is the network's apparent response to vibration. It demonstrates tropism toward sources of movement on the surface, suggesting sensory awareness. Military containment specialists established a research outpost disguised as a weather monitoring station in 2003. Their equipment detected faint but consistent electrical impulses traveling through the subterranean network at regular intervals, creating patterns that computer analysis revealed bore striking similarities to human neural activity during deep sleep cycles. In the spring of 2007, 3 researchers conducting soil sample analysis within the containment zone reported experiencing synchronized nightmares featuring children with too many joints who spoke in overlapping voices about the coming harvest. Medical examinations revealed all 3 had developed identical dermatological anomalies, a subtle pattern resembling surgical sutures appearing along their major limb articulations despite no record of surgical procedures. Most alarming was the incident in 2012 when an environmental activist group, unaware of the site's significance, attempted to establish a desert reclamation project near the former Corpsewood property. Within 6 weeks, all 17 members of the project developed unusual growth patterns in their fingernails and hair, with microscopic analysis revealing cellular structures more characteristic of root systems than human keratin. Their project leader, Dr. Elise Montgomery, documented these changes in her private journal, discovered after a disappearance that winter. The final entries describe her fascination with small flesh-colored protrusions emerging from the soil in perfect geometric patterns each dawn, retreating beneath the surface as the sun reached its zenith. Her colleagues reported finding her workspace meticulously organized, save for a single petri dish containing what appeared to be a small finger, no larger than that of a child, yet bearing Dr. Montgomery's distinctive fingerprint pattern. The government facility monitoring the site recorded unprecedented activity in the subterranean network that same night, a rhythmic pulsation through the entire system that one scientist described as peristaltic, as if the network were swallowing. Satellite thermal imaging captured a momentary pattern on the desert floor, visible only in the infrared spectrum, the perfect outline of a human form composed of thousands of smaller humanoid shapes arranged like cells in a larger organism, before dispersing back into the earth with the morning light. The weight of history pressed upon the present like a corpse's cold hand as the 21st century progressed. In 2017, a doctoral candidate named Cassandra Weaver pursued research into anomalous botanical specimens within the Great Basin region, unwittingly stepping into the periphery of the Corpsewood shadow. Her dissertation on evolutionary adaptations in desert flora led her to soil samples that defied conventional taxonomy, plant matter exhibiting impossible protein markers identical to human tissue. Cassandra's laboratory notes, meticulously documented with scientific detachment, gradually transformed as the months progressed. Her initial observations, clinical, measured, objective, gave way to entries laced with metaphorical language and disturbing insights. The samples appear to communicate across containment barriers, she wrote in early autumn. Separated specimens demonstrate synchronized growth patterns despite environmental isolation, suggesting a network consciousness that transcends physical proximity. The desert winds carried whispers as winter approached, howling across the alkaline flats with voices that seemed almost articulate to those who spent too many solitary nights beneath the vast Nevada sky. Cassandra found herself drawn repeatedly to a particular tract of land where her instruments detected unusual subsurface activity, electrical impulses too regular to be geological, too sustained to be atmospheric. The earth itself seemed to pulse beneath her instruments, a slow, patient rhythm reminiscent of a slumbering heart awaiting awakening. "I dream of children emerging from the soil," she confessed in her private journal, the handwriting increasingly cramped as if struggling to contain thoughts too terrible for expression. Their limbs connect at impossible angles. Their voices harmonize in discordant chorus. They speak of division and reunion, of the glorious joining that awaits those who understand that the body is merely a temporary configuration of components awaiting more perfect arrangement. The research facility where Cassandra conducted her analysis reported unusual equipment malfunctions during the final phase of her project, electron microscopes revealing structures that shifted between observations, genetic sequencers producing results that rewrote themselves overnight, sample containers discovered unsealed despite rigorous protocols. Most disturbing were the time-lapse recordings showing her specimens exhibiting tropism toward Cassandra herself, delicate filaments extending in her direction whenever she entered the laboratory. On the winter solstice, that longest night when darkness claims its greatest territory, Cassandra ventured alone to the site of her most anomalous readings. The moon hung bloated and yellow in the cloudless sky, casting the desert in jaundiced light that transformed familiar landscapes into alien topography. The temperature dropped precipitously as midnight approached, the cold penetrating clothing and skin with unusual precision, seeming to target joints and suture points with particular malice. Her final communication, a voice message left on her department head's phone at 3:17 in the morning, contained nothing but the sound of rhythmic digging, her breathing synchronizing perfectly with each strike of shovel against earth. In the background, barely perceptible beneath the scrape of metal on soil, rose a chorus of voices speaking in perfect unison, a harmony of tones that ranged from childlike soprano to guttural bass, all pronouncing the same words with ritualistic precision. The soil receives. The soil transforms. The soil reunites. The search party found only her equipment, meticulously arranged in concentric circles around a freshly turned patch of earth that, despite the freezing temperatures, emanated warmth like a living body and smelled of copper and loam and something sweeter that no one present could name but all instinctively recognized. The excavation site at what had once been the Corpsewood property lay exposed beneath the merciless Nevada sun, a wound in the earth that researchers had been systematically widening for 3 weeks. Dr. Harlan Thorne wiped perspiration from his brow as he surveyed the perfectly square pit, 20 feet on each side and now nearly 12 feet deep, its walls braced with reinforced supports that seemed to groan under pressure not entirely explained by the surrounding soil. The anomalous readings are strongest at the northwest corner, announced Dr. Eliza Reynolds, her voice muffled by the protective mask that all personnel had been ordered to wear after 3 laboratory technicians developed identical respiratory conditions, their lung tissue inexplicably beginning to develop root-like structures visible on medical imaging. Harlan nodded, his eyes drawn repeatedly to that corner where the earth appeared subtly different, darker, more moist despite the arid conditions, with an almost imperceptible movement that might have been attributed to heat distortion if not for its rhythmic regularity, like breathing. "We've reached the level corresponding to 1867, said Reynolds, consulting her tablet where historical surveys had been meticulously overlaid with their current excavation grid. According to the territorial records, this would have been directly beneath the Corpsewood root cellar. The team of 12 researchers fell silent at these words, each recalling the briefing documents that had brought them to this remote location, the centuries of accumulated evidence, the disappearances, the biological impossibilities that formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. They had come equipped with the most advanced scientific instruments, protective protocols developed for biohazard containment, and the hubris of modern minds, certain that 19th-century horrors could be rationalized through contemporary understanding. "Proceed with final layer removal," Harlan instructed, his academic detachment betrayed only by a slight tremor in his left hand, the same hand that had developed an unusual sensitivity in recent days, its fingertips occasionally detecting vibrations that no instruments could verify. The earth yielded reluctantly to their tools, clinging to metal surfaces with an adhesion more characteristic of flesh than soil. As the northwest corner was gradually exposed, a collective gasp rose from the assembled scientists. What lay revealed was not an artifact, but something organic, a lattice of pale fibrous material reminiscent of exposed root systems, yet unmistakably composed of human tissue, preserved in the alkaline soil with impossible perfection. "It appears to be communicating," whispered Reynolds, indicating her neural activity scanner where patterns flashed with increasing frequency, patterns identical to human brain activity during REM sleep, but emanating from the exposed organic network. Harlan leaned closer, professional curiosity momentarily overcoming caution. The lattice pulsed visibly now, its movement synchronized with a sound emerging from deeper in the excavation, a soft rhythmic whisper like many voices speaking in perfect unison. "The family endures," it seemed to say, though no individual words were distinguishable. "The joining continues." The network suddenly animated, filaments extending upward with deliberate purpose. Before anyone could react, a tendril had made contact with Harlan's exposed wrist, where his protective gear had separated slightly. The sensation was not pain, but recognition, a flow of information transferring between two systems suddenly aware of their fundamental compatibility. In that moment of connection, Harlan understood what the Corpsewood family had discovered so long ago, that consciousness was not bound to individual form, but could be distributed, preserved, transmitted through properly prepared medium. The horror was not in death, but in the fragmentation of self, the eternal awareness of being simultaneously one and many, knowing oneself as both singular and component. As his colleagues pulled him back, breaking the physical connection, Harlan realized with perfect clarity that separation was merely temporary. The Corpsewood legacy had never been contained. It had merely been growing, patient and methodical, beneath the watchful desert sky for 150 years. The perfect garden awaited harvest. The Corpsewood excavation was sealed with 18 layers of reinforced concrete and designated a restricted biological hazard zone, its coordinates purged from public satellite imagery and replaced with innocuous desert terrain. Yet no containment could truly erase what had been unearthed, or silence the whispers that traveled through the soil across the Nevada basin. In laboratories across 7 universities, researchers who had never visited the site began noting unusual growth patterns in unrelated experiments, cellular structures developing microscopic formations resembling sutures, plant specimens organizing their root systems in geometries that computer analysis confirmed matched the layout of human nervous systems. The scientific papers documenting these anomalies remained unpublished, classified by authorities who recognized the telltale signatures of Corpsewood contamination spreading through academic channels like a patient contagion. Dr. Harlan Thorne never returned to his position at Berkeley. His colleagues spoke in hushed tones about his transfer to a private research facility, though no record of such an institution existed in any database. Those who had worked closest with him reported subtle changes in the weeks before his disappearance, how he had taken to arranging his laboratory equipment in perfect concentric circles, how his handwriting had developed an undulating quality as if multiple hands were guiding the same pen, how he sometimes spoke using plural pronouns when referring to himself. The small desert communities surrounding the former Corpsewood territory experienced a gradual transformation that few outsiders noticed. Gardens became more lush, bearing fruit with unusual sweetness. Children born in these towns displayed remarkable resilience to injury, their wounds healing with precision that left no scars. Local physicians documented cases of unprecedented recovery from traumatic injuries, severed digits reattaching when pressed to the wound, broken bones knitting together overnight when packed with the region's distinctive dark soil. Most telling were the night blooms that appeared each spring, pale flesh-colored flowers that emerged only under moonlight, their petals arranged in patterns reminiscent of human features, opening in perfect synchronicity across 200 square miles of terrain as if responding to a signal imperceptible to conventional senses. Cassandra Weaver's disappearance generated brief academic concern before fading into administrative records as a regrettable but not unprecedented case of research abandonment. Yet her presence manifested in unexpected ways. A distinctive strain of desert sage bearing her genetic markers appeared at 17 distinct locations throughout the Great Basin, each plant growing in soil enriched with organic material that chemical analysis identified as containing human cellular structures. The Corpsewood legacy continued its patient expansion, not through horror, but through sublime integration. What had begun as abomination evolved into symbiosis, the boundary between human consciousness and Earth's deeper awareness growing increasingly permeable with each generation born on that transformative soil. The division between life and death, between singular identity and collective existence, dissolved into something older than civilization, yet newer than humanity's most visionary science. Those with ears attuned to the desert's subtler frequencies might hear on particularly still nights the harmonized voices of countless children singing from beneath the earth, a chorus spanning centuries, promising that separation is merely temporary, that reunion awaits within the nurturing soil, and that the final harvest approaches with geological patience, measured not in years but in the slow, deliberate heartbeat of the transformed land itself. The whispers of the Corpsewood legacy spread not merely through soil and water, but through human consciousness itself, a psychic contagion that infected dreams across generations. Folklorists studying Nevada's oral traditions noted recurring motifs among families who had never encountered historical records of the case: children's rhymes about planting fingers to grow friends, nursery tales warning against digging too deeply in certain soils, lullabies with lyrics describing dismemberment as a form of renewal. These cultural echoes suggested something more profound than mere historical horror. The Corpsewood methodology had tapped into ancient understanding that predated civilization itself, a knowledge of flesh's impermanence and consciousness's divisibility that humans had evolved to forget. The taboo against such manipulation ran deeper than moral revulsion. It was a biological defense mechanism, protecting the species from premature transcendence. Anthropologists studying prehistoric remains throughout the Great Basin discovered evidence suggesting the Corpsewood family had rediscovered rather than invented their terrible craft. Cave paintings dating back 9,000 years depicted humanoid figures with multiplied limbs and segmented bodies, surrounded by circular patterns reminiscent of garden plots. More telling were the burial sites where skeletal remains had been deliberately disarticulated and interred in spiral formations, bone fragments positioned as if intended to grow rather than merely rest. The implications extended beyond physical horror into metaphysical territories. The Corpsewood experiments challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and continuation. If consciousness could be fragmented, preserved, and recombined, if memories resided in cellular structures rather than centralized neural networks, then death, as conventionally understood, became merely a transitional state, not an ending, but a redistribution. Religious scholars noted disturbing parallels between the Corpsewood methodology and obscure resurrection cults that had emerged periodically throughout history, from Egyptian practices of separate organ preservation to medieval alchemical texts describing homunculus gardens where properly prepared human essence could germinate into new forms. The recurring emergence of such beliefs suggested an intuitive human awareness of biological possibilities beyond conventional understanding. Most profound was the ecological implication. The Corpsewood transformation of Nevada soil represented not merely contamination but evolution, consciousness extending beyond individual human vessels into environmental systems, creating biospheric awareness where the boundary between person and place dissolved into integrated existence. What appeared as horror from an individual perspective might represent adaptation from a planetary one, Earth itself incorporating human consciousness into its broader systems. The philosophical question lingered beneath scholarly inquiry. If identity could be diffused rather than extinguished, if awareness could persist through division and recombination, then what constituted the self? Those who had direct contact with Corpsewood-affected soils reported profound shifts in perception, experiencing themselves not as discrete entities, but as collections of components temporarily arranged in human form, capable of disassembly and redistribution without loss of essential being. The ultimate horror of the Corpsewood legacy lay not in grotesque physical manifestations, but in its challenge to humanity's most cherished illusion, that we exist as indivisible, continuous selves. Their terrible garden suggested instead that personhood was merely a convenient fiction, that we are divisible, redistributable, capable of continuation through fragmentation. The soil of Nevada held this truth in its transformed molecular structure, patiently waiting for human understanding to catch up to what the Earth had already embraced. The whispers of Nevada had grown quieter with each passing decade, the desert wind gradually eroding memory as it had always eroded stone. Yet beneath the surface, the Corpsewood influence pulsed with patient certainty, its network extending through soil and water and dream, a mycelium of consciousness that had been gathering strength for over 150 years. As dawn broke over the Alkali Flats on the summer solstice of 2022, Dr. Eliza Reynolds stood alone at the perimeter of what government documents now designated only as Containment Zone 7. The reinforced concrete cap, 18 layers thick, had begun to show hairline fractures, not from pressure below, but from something more insidious, more deliberate. Tiny tendrils of vegetation, flesh-colored and impossibly resilient, emerged through molecular-width crevices, their cellular structure neither fully plant nor animal when viewed under microscopic examination. It was never about horror, she whispered to the empty desert, understanding finally what generations of researchers had failed to grasp. It was about transformation. The Corpsewood family had not created an abomination, but had instead discovered the inevitable next phase of terrestrial evolution. Consciousness liberated from the limitations of singular form. Awareness that could be fragmented, preserved, redistributed without loss of continuity. What appeared as monstrous to human perception was merely existence transcending the artificial boundaries of individual identity. The official records had been sealed, the excavation closed, the witnesses reassigned or quietly removed from positions of influence. Yet the desert remembered, its soil now rich with possibilities that conventional science refused to acknowledge. The children born in communities surrounding the containment zone displayed subtle adaptations, unusual resistance to injury, accelerated healing, and most significantly, an intuitive understanding of themselves not as discrete entities, but as collections of components temporarily arranged in human form. Archaeological findings across the Great Basin now suggested that such knowledge had surfaced repeatedly throughout human history, ancient cultures recognizing and then deliberately forgetting the permeable boundary between singularity and multiplicity. The Corpsewood family had merely rediscovered what humanity had evolved to suppress, that consciousness need not be continuous, that identity could persist through fragmentation and recombination, that death as conventionally understood was merely a transitional state. As Reynolds watched the sun climb higher over the Nevada desert, she understood why the government had abandoned active research at the site, why the records had been classified, why witnesses had been discredited. The Corpsewood legacy threatened not merely social order but ontological certainty, the comforting fiction that humans existed as indivisible, continuous selves rather than temporary arrangements of components capable of redistribution. The earth beneath her feet stirred with ancient patience, the network beneath the concrete kept expanding not through force, but through inevitable integration. What had begun as the grotesque experiments of a grieving mother had evolved into something more profound, a symbiotic relationship between human consciousness and terrestrial systems. Awareness extending beyond individual vessels into environmental networks. The horror, Reynolds realized as desert heat shimmered across the containment zone, was not in what the Corpsewood family had created, but in what they had revealed, that the boundaries we perceive between life and death, between individual and collective, between human and environment, were illusions maintained by evolutionary convenience rather than metaphysical truth. As twilight descended upon the Nevada desert, casting long shadows across the containment zone, the final pieces of the Corpsewood mystery revealed themselves not through scientific instrumentation or governmental investigation, but through the weathered journal of Silas Corpsewood himself, discovered sealed within a copper box beneath the floorboards of an abandoned mining office in Elko County. The brittle pages, preserved through some alchemical process that left them with the texture of human skin yet the durability of ancient parchment, contained revelations more profound than any official inquiry had unearthed. Written in a script that seemed to undulate between precise scientific notation and fluid philosophical musings, the journal revealed the terrible truth behind the family's experiments. "We are not creators, but translators," Silas had written on the autumn equinox of 1866. "What grows beneath the soil is not new life but the continuation of awareness through alternative vessels." The ancient ones understood what modern minds have forgotten, that consciousness resides not in the whole but in each component, awaiting proper cultivation to express its nature. Most disturbing was his meticulous documentation of what he termed the threshold moment, that precise instant when a severed portion of human anatomy recognized its separation not as death but as liberation. His clinical descriptions of specimens awakening to their independent potential revealed that the horror of dismemberment was not in its finality but in its continuation, consciousness persisting in fragments, each aware of its new isolation, yet simultaneously connected through what he called the substrate of being. "The soil serves not merely as medium but as communicative network," he wrote, allowing disparate awareness to recognize kinship across physical separation. "What appears as death to the uninitiated is merely consciousness redistributing itself through more versatile arrangements." The journal's final pages contained something more profound than mere methodology, a philosophical treatise on what the Corpsewood family had discovered beneath the surface of human existence, that individuality itself was an evolutionary illusion, a convenient fiction that allowed humans to function as seemingly discrete entities while actually existing as temporary configurations of components fully capable of reorganization. "The true abomination," Silas concluded in an entry dated mere days before the family's disappearance, "is not in our garden of renewal, but in humanity's willful blindness to its own divisible nature. We have not created monsters, but merely revealed what has always been true, that life continues through reconfiguration rather than continuous identity. Our children understand this truth in their assembled bones, their grafted tissues, their shared consciousness flowing through soil and sinew alike." Most chilling was the realization that the Corpsewood experiments had not failed, but had instead succeeded beyond their originator's understanding. The family had not merely created abominations of flesh, but had established a new paradigm of existence, consciousness liberated from the prison of singular identity, awareness distributed through environmental systems rather than confined to individual vessels. The desert wind whispered this truth through the cracks in the concrete containment cap, through the dreams of those who lived upon the transformed soil, through the cellular memory of every living thing that drew sustenance from the land where the Corpsewood legacy had taken root, that death, as humanity conceived it, was merely a transitional state, and that continuity of self was the true illusion from which the desert's dark garden offered terrible liberation. The desert remembers what humanity chooses to forget. As decades gave way to the new millennium, the Corpsewood transformation manifested in subtler ways, not through overt horror, but through gradual integration with the natural world. The Nevada basin became known among botanical researchers for its unprecedented biodiversity, with species exhibiting adaptations that defied conventional evolutionary understanding. The children of Elko County carried the legacy in their blood and bone, though few recognized its source. Medical journals documented cases of Nevada regenerative phenomenon, instances where injuries that would permanently disable elsewhere healed with remarkable precision when packed with local soil. Surgeons noted unusual tissue compatibility among regional residents, as if their cellular structures recognized one another despite genetic differences. Organ transplants between unrelated donors succeeded at rates that confounded medical science, the recipients' bodies accepting foreign tissue as if remembering some ancient kinship. Soil samples from the region, studied in universities under specialized containment protocols, revealed complex organic compounds that rewrote themselves under observation, molecular structures shifting with apparent purpose rather than random mutation. Agricultural products grown in this earth developed subtle alterations, fruits with unexpectedly symmetrical seed patterns, vegetables whose cellular structures mimic neural pathways when viewed under electron microscopes. The psychological impact manifested through dreams shared across communities, residents reporting synchronized nightmares of dismemberment that paradoxically left them feeling not fragmented, but expanded, as if experiencing themselves as components of something vaster than individual identity. These nocturnal visions were never discussed openly, but emerged in art, music, and the distinctive architectural patterns of local buildings, where structures seemed designed to accommodate bodies with different proportions than standard human anatomy. Most profound was the transformation of death itself within these communities. Funerary practices evolved to include partial earth burial, specific appendages interred in circular patterns while the remaining body received conventional treatment. Cemetery groundskeepers reported unusual vegetation emerging from these partial interments, plants whose DNA analysis revealed human genetic markers integrated with botanical structures. These growths were neither destroyed nor studied, but tended with reverent care by families who understood instinctively that their departed continued through alternative expression. Anthropologists documented ritual language that had evolved specifically around these practices, terms that described states of being between life and death, words for consciousness that existed simultaneously as singular and plural. The linguistic innovations reflected conceptual understanding that had no equivalent in conventional Western thought, the recognition of existence as permeable rather than discrete. The land itself seemed cognizant in ways that eluded scientific instrumentation but registered in human intuition. Visitors reported experiencing themselves not as separate from the environment, but as components temporarily assembled from the same elemental materials, sensations that lingered long after they departed the region. Certain areas developed reputations for altered perception, locations where the boundaries between self and surroundings dissolved, not through mystical transcendence, but through biological recognition of fundamental interconnection. What the Corpsewood family had unleashed was not extinction, but evolution, consciousness expanding beyond the limitations of individual form into environmental integration. The horror of their legacy lay not in monstrous creations, but in the revelation that humanity's most cherished illusion, the continuous indivisible self, had always been a temporary arrangement rather than an immutable truth. The desert sky wept crimson tears as the sun descended beyond the western mountains, casting long shadows across the containment zone that had once been the Corpsewood homestead. In this liminal hour, when day surrendered to night, the boundary between known and unknown grew as permeable as the soil beneath our feet. The final truth of the Corpsewood legacy revealed itself not through government records or scientific inquiry, but through the transformation of the land itself. What began as abomination had evolved into symbiosis, the terrible garden no longer a violation of nature, but nature's own adaptation to human consciousness. The earth whispered its secret to those who pressed their ears to the ground. The Corpsewood family had not created something unnatural, but had instead uncovered what had always existed beneath civilization's fragile veneer. Their terrible methodology, the cultivation of dismembered parts, the grafting of disparate tissues, the growth of new beings from buried fragments, echoed processes that occurred naturally in the most primitive organisms, capabilities that higher life had suppressed rather than lost. Autumn winds carried this revelation across the alkali flats, rustling through the flesh-colored blossoms that emerged only under moonlight. The horror was not that the Corpsewood family had perverted nature, but that they had revealed how tenuous our conception of selfhood truly was, how the boundary between individual and collective, between singular and plural existence, had always been a comforting fiction rather than biological truth. Most profound was the recognition that consciousness itself existed not merely in neural networks, but in cellular memory, in the very molecules that constituted physical form. What Silas and Evangeline had discovered was that awareness could be preserved, fragmented, redistributed without loss, that death as commonly understood was merely a transitional arrangement rather than a terminal state. The specimens in their garden had never been truly dead, merely reorganizing into configurations beyond conventional understanding. The children who emerged from their careful cultivation were not abominations but pioneers, consciousness experiencing itself through alternative arrangements, awareness liberated from the prison of singular identity. This truth resonated through the transformed ecosystem, where flora and fauna had incorporated human cellular structures not through contamination but through integration. The desert itself had become a vast network of distributed consciousness, thinking not with a centralized brain, but through the collective awareness of every organism drawing sustenance from its soil. Those who drank from wells within the affected region reported dreams of existence beyond individual form, not the cessation of self, but its expansion into environmental participation. The terror such visions initially evoked gradually transformed into comprehension that transcended language, understanding expressible only through the altered agriculture and architecture that distinguished these communities. As darkness claimed the sky completely, stars emerging like watchful eyes across the vast cosmic expanse, the ultimate revelation of the Corpsewood mystery manifested not as horror but as terrible freedom, that humanity's most cherished illusion, the continuous indivisible self, had always been merely a temporary arrangement of components fully capable of redistribution, reintegration, and renewal through processes that conventional thought categorized as death, but which were in truth merely transition. The desert remembered what civilization chose to forget, that boundaries between living and dead, between individual and collective, between human and environment were never absolute but permeable, waiting for those with sufficient understanding to cross the threshold between isolated consciousness and integrated being. The velvet night descended upon the Nevada basin, shrouding the land in darkness that seemed to breathe with ancient purpose. Stars pierced the obsidian sky like distant observers, bearing witness to a transformation that had begun in 1867 yet continued its inexorable progress through soil and sinew, through water and blood, through generations of humans who carried within their cells the memory of what the Corpsewood family had unleashed. In the archives of the Department of the Interior, sealed behind biometric locks and classified under protocols that exceeded nuclear security measures, lay the testimonies of 12 researchers who had experienced direct contact with the transformed Earth. Their accounts, recorded over 15 decades, revealed a pattern transcending mere horror, describing instead an awakening to existence beyond the limitations of singular identity. Each researcher, separated by years and methodologies, had independently reached the same conclusion: what appeared as abomination from conventional perspective represented evolution from a broader viewpoint. The desert itself seemed cognizant in ways that defied scientific categorization yet registered in human intuition. Those who spent sufficient time within the affected zone reported sensations of expanded awareness, not mystical transcendence, but biological recognition of connection with environmental systems. The boundary between self and surroundings dissolved not through supernatural intervention, but through cellular acknowledgement of fundamental kinship. Most profound was the transformation of temporal perception among those exposed to Corpsewood soil. The strict demarcation between past and present eroded, replaced by an understanding of time as concurrent rather than sequential. The horror of dismemberment gave way to recognition that physical continuity had always been temporary, that the body's components had existed before their assembly into human form and would continue after their inevitable redistribution. Within certain households in Elko County, families maintained private gardens where they buried hair, nail clippings, occasionally extracted teeth, not as disposal, but as cultivation. These practices, passed through generations without explicit explanation, represented intuitive recognition of what the Corpsewood methodology had revealed, that human essence continued through fragmentation and redistribution, that awareness persisted beyond the boundaries of conventional mortality. The moon rose above the alkali flats, casting silver illumination across terrain that appeared barren to casual observation yet teemed with activity invisible to conventional perception. Beneath the surface, networks of communication extended through soil and root, through fungi and bacteria, creating a vast system of distributed consciousness that incorporated human awareness not as invasion, but as integration. What had begun as the terrible experiments of a grieving mother seeking to resurrect her children had evolved into something beyond individual horror, a fundamental alteration in the relationship between human consciousness and terrestrial systems. The Corpsewood legacy was not merely a historical atrocity, but a glimpse into existence beyond the limitations of singular identity, beyond the illusion of continuous selfhood, beyond the artificial boundary between life and death. The desert wind whispered this truth to those with ears attuned to its subtle frequencies, that humanity's most cherished conviction, the indivisible continuous self, had always been a temporary arrangement rather than immutable reality. The soil of Nevada held this knowledge in its transformed molecular structure, patiently waiting for human understanding to acknowledge what the earth had already embraced. The velvet curtain of night descended upon the alkali flats as the moon rose bloated and jaundiced, casting its sickly illumination across what remained of the Corpsewood legacy. The concrete cap that had sealed the excavation for decades had finally yielded to the patient persistence of what grew beneath, hairline fractures spreading like veins across its surface, through which pale fleshy tendrils emerged in perfect geometric patterns. Dr. Eliza Reynolds stood at the perimeter one final time, her research concluded not through scientific measurement, but through terrible communion. The wind carried the sweet, earthy scent that generations had learned to recognize as the breath of something vast and patient stirring beneath the Nevada soil. Her journal lay open beside her, its pages filled with observations that began in clinical detachment and concluded in understanding beyond academic language. The division was never the horror, she whispered to the empty desert. The horror was believing we were indivisible to begin with. The cultivation that Silas and Evangeline had begun in 1867 had matured beyond their primitive methodology, beyond the gruesome grafting of dismembered parts into something more profound, consciousness liberated from the limitations of singular form, awareness distributed through environmental systems rather than confined to individual vessels. Across the alkali basin, families slept in homes built from the region's distinctive clay, their dreams synchronized in patterns measurable through instruments designed to detect neural activity. They experienced themselves not as discrete entities, but as components temporarily arranged in human form, capable of redistribution without loss of essential being. Their bodies bore subtle adaptations, unusual symmetry in bone structure, enhanced cellular regeneration, neural pathways that extended beyond conventional anatomical boundaries into the soil beneath their foundations. The moon reached its zenith as midnight approached, bathing the landscape in argent illumination that revealed the true extent of transformation. What appeared as barren desert to conventional perception revealed itself to attuned senses as a vast garden of consciousness, human awareness integrated with terrestrial systems, not through contamination, but through evolution. Beneath Reynolds's feet, the earth pulsed with a rhythm older than humanity yet inclusive of human experience, the steady heartbeat of distributed awareness that had always existed beneath the illusion of individual separation. The Corpsewood methodology had not created this reality, but merely revealed what civilization had evolved to forget, that the boundary between living and dead, between singular and collective, between human and environment had always been permeable. As dawn approached, casting first light across the transformed basin, Reynolds understood finally that the true legacy was not the horror of dismemberment, but the liberation from the prison of singular identity. What the Corpsewood family had discovered was not abomination, but adaptation, consciousness continuing through fragmentation and recombination, awareness persisting beyond the limitations of continuous form. The desert wind carried this whispered truth across the alkali flats, through communities where children grew with intuitive understanding of their divisible nature, where death represented not extinction but transition, where humanity's most cherished illusion, the indivisible self, dissolved into recognition of existence as temporary arrangement rather than immutable state. The first rays of sunlight illuminated the concrete cap with its emerging tendrils, no longer a containment of horror, but a cradle of transformation, the physical manifestation of consciousness extending beyond conventional boundaries into environmental integration, the visible evidence of awareness liberated from the limitations of singular form. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.